a mathematical pattern that has destroyed every dominant empire for the last 2,000 years, not through invasion, not through natural disaster, through a self-inflicted economic cycle that once it begins has never been reversed. Rome followed it. The sequence took 2 centuries, but every stage occurred exactly as predicted. The Spanish Empire followed it and declared bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years, despite controlling the world's silver supply. The British Empire followed it and lost a quarter of the Earth's surface, within 30 years of the pattern reaching stage 5. The Soviet Union followed it and disintegrated in 900 days from superpower to 15 separate nations faster than most people could process what was happening. 3 different centuries, 3 different political systems, 3 different currencies, but the exact same 6-stage collapse sequence. YS plays bid, infalling 7 time, YS today with a preview lastive. And right now, in January 2026, the United States has completed 5 of those 6 stages. This is not theory. This is pattern recognition, historical mathematics. On November 15th, 2024, the United States national debt officially crossed $36 trillion. Just 3 months earlier, in July, it had been $35 trillion. The debt is now growing by approximately $1 trillion every 90 days, $333 billion per month, $11 billion per day. By the time you finish watching this video, the United States will have borrowed another $7.6 million. The annual cost of servicing that debt, just the interest payments, not paying down the principal, now exceeds $1 trillion per year. That is more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any discretionary spending category in the federal budget. And it is accelerating. By mid-2026, interest payments are projected to reach $2 billion per day. Well before the resigned billion and with you now the signed with the signed, and we've court and why that at 2%, and well signed with you now that important. The debt to GDP ratio currently sits at 122%. For context, when the British Empire hit 249% debt to GDP in 1945, it lost India 2 years later, and its reserve currency status immediately. When the Soviet Union's economic output could no longer sustain its military commitments in 1989, the empire collapsed in less than 3 years. The United States is not facing a political crisis. It is not facing a military crisis. It is facing the same crisis that has ended every empire before it. The mathematics of unsustainable debt combined with the loss of productive capacity and the fracturing of social cohesion. Stage 1, military overextension, completed. Stage 2, debt accumulation, completed. Stage 3, currency debasement, completed. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, in progress. Stage 5, social fracture, we are here. Stage 6 is the reset. And in 2,000 years of recorded history, no empire has ever stopped the sequence once Stage 5 begins. This is the story of that pattern, how it destroyed Rome, how it destroyed Britain, how it destroyed the Soviet Union, and why the United States, despite its military, its technology, its wealth, cannot escape it. The sequence has never changed. The only variable is time. The historical proof. The Roman Empire. The crisis of the 3rd century. On March 18th, 235 CE, Emperor Alexander Severus was assassinated by his own soldiers near Mogontiacum in what is now Germany. He was the last emperor of the Severan dynasty. What followed was 50 years that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when the Roman Empire nearly ceased to exist. Over the next 49 years, the Roman throne changed hands 26 times, not through elections, not through hereditary succession, through military coups and assassinations. These were the barracks emperors' generals elevated by their armies, ruling for months or sometimes just weeks before being murdered by the next claimant. But the political chaos was not the crisis. It was the symptom. Stage 1, military overextension. By 235 CE, Rome's borders stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. The legions were scattered across 3 continents, defending frontiers against Germanic tribes in the north, Sassanid Persians in the east, and internal rebellions everywhere. The army had become too large to sustain and too powerful to control. Stage 2, debt accumulation. To pay the legions the only thing keeping emperors alive, Rome increased taxes across every province, land taxes, property taxes, war levies, confiscations of silver from wealthy citizens. Diocletian later instituted systematic expropriations and annual tribute payments collected largely in grain and goods rather than currency. Stage 3, currency debasement. Here is where the mathematics became inevitable. Under Septimius Severus, the silver content in the denarius Rome's primary coin was reduced from 90% pure silver to approximately 50-60%. By 270 CE, the Antoninianus coin contained less than 5% silver. The empire was literally printing money by mixing base metals with trace amounts of precious metal and calling it currency. Gresham's law took effect immediately. Citizens hoarded the old silver coins and only spent the debased currency. Archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Historians have discovered 1,724 coin hoards buried in the 1st century, 1,985 inches the 2nd century, but 3,937 hoards buried during the 3rd century. Romans were literally hiding their wealth underground rather than participating in the economy. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. With currency worthless, the empire reverted to barter. Long-distance trade collapsed. The specialized industrial centers that had made Rome efficient wine from Gaul, grain from Egypt, weapons from Spain began to disappear. Local subsistence production replaced interconnected commerce. Craftsmen's guilds dissolved. The sophisticated supply chains that fed the cities broke down. Stage 5. Social and political fracture. Between 260 and 274 CE, the Roman Empire split into 3 competing entities. The Gallic Empire controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain. The Palmyrene Empire controlled Egypt and the eastern provinces. Only Italy and the Balkans remained under central control. The empire was fragmenting geographically because it had already fragmented economically. Thanks for watching, and I think you compline to blind and wary. Stage 6. The Reset. In 284 CE, Diocletian took power and fundamentally restructured the entire Roman system. He divided the empire into administrative quarters, reformed the military, attempted price controls, which failed catastrophically, and created a new monetary system. The old empire was gone. What emerged was something different, more authoritarian, less economically dynamic, and permanently changed. The turning point was not political. It was the moment Rome debased its currency to pay its soldiers, and discovered it could not reverse the inflationary spiral that followed. The British Empire. From superpower to liquidation. In 1914, the British Empire controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and population. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London was the financial center of the world. British naval supremacy was unquestioned. 40 years later, the empire was gone. Stage 1. Military overextension. 2 world wars. Britain committed to defending territories on 6 continents while simultaneously fighting the most expensive conflicts in human history. By 1944 to 45, military spending consumed 80% of the entire national budget. Stage 2. Debt accumulation. In 1939, Britain's national debt stood at 135% of GDP. By 1945, it had reached 249%, the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in British history. The government was borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. The cash deficit by June 1945 was £4.055 billion. Foreign assets, which had been £4 billion in 1939, were liquidated down to £3 billion to finance the war effort. But worse than the government debt were the sterling balances £3.35 billion owed to countries across the British Empire and Commonwealth that had supplied goods, troops, and resources during the war. India alone held £1.51 billion in blocked sterling, equivalent to $83.93 billion in today's currency. These were funds that Britain legally owed but could not pay. If you water and is claying cruspete and is brack, we have go and I waiter. Stage 3. Currency debasement. In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, Britain was forced to accept the US dollar, not the pound, as the new global reserve currency. In exchange for a $3.75 billion loan from the United States, Britain agreed to make the pound convertible to gold and dollars by the 15th of July, 1947. On the 14th of August 1947, the exact day India and Pakistan signed their sterling balance agreements, expecting periodic repayments in convertible currency, Britain had £1. 16 billion in outstanding debt to India. 5 days later, on the 19th of August 1947, Britain revoked the convertibility of the pound, 1 day before India's independence. This was a technical default not just to the United States, but to every country holding sterling balances expecting to convert them to gold or dollars. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. Britain's industrial output, already damaged by wartime production, could not compete with an undamaged American manufacturing base. India, which had been financing British consumption through forced loans, was about to become independent and stop the transfer. Stage 5. Social and political fracture. The British population, after 6 years of total war, demanded social welfare programs, healthcare, housing, education. The government could not afford both empire and welfare state. Public support for maintaining colonies evaporated. Stage 6. The Reset. On the 15th of August 1947, India gained independence. Over the next 7 years, Britain systematically decolonized. Palestine in 1948, Burma in 1948, Ceylon in 1948, Malaya through the 1950 seconds. By 1954, the empire that had ruled a quarter of humanity was reduced to a mid-sized European nation with scattered remnant territories. The turning point was not military defeat. It was the moment in 1944 when Britain's debt to GDP crossed 200% and the nation realized it could no longer afford both its social obligations and its imperial commitments. The Soviet Union collapsed in 900 days. In 1989, the Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower with 293 million citizens, the world's largest military and satellite state spanning from Berlin to Vladivostok. In 1991, it ceased to exist. Stage 1. Military overextension. The Soviet Union maintained military forces in Eastern Europe, Afghanistan, Cuba, Africa, and Asia, while engaging in a 40-year arms race with the United States. The Afghan War alone, 1979 to 1989, cost billions of rubles and accomplished nothing except demonstrating Soviet military limits. Stage 2. Debt and economic stagnation. By the 1980 seconds, the centrally planned economy could not match Western productivity. Factory equipment was decades outdated. Consumer goods were scarce. The oil revenues that had sustained the system through the 1970 seconds collapsed when oil prices crashed in the 1980 seconds. Resently, and that is a backsword op to bring resented this video. Stage 3. Currency worthlessness. The ruble had no value outside Soviet borders. International trade required hard currency dollars, marks, yen. Soviet citizens preferred Western goods when available. Black markets flourished. Stage 4. Industrial decay. Soviet manufacturing was trapped in obsolescence. While the West developed computers and telecommunications, the USSR produced heavy machinery using 1950 seconds technology. The gap in living standards became undeniable. And first from the way are, and from the Nuna stated, Stage 5. Social and political fracture. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost openness intended to save the system, instead exposed how broken it was. Once people could speak freely, they revealed their resentment. Once republics had autonomy, they demanded independence. Stage 6. The reset. The sequence accelerated with shocking speed. On the 12th of June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Federation, a position within the Soviet Union but not subordinate to it. On the 19th of August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup to stop the dissolution. The coup collapsed within 3 days. On the 25th of December 1991, Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. On the 26th of December 1991, the Supreme Soviet voted the Soviet Union out of existence. From superpower to 15 independent nations in 900 days. Now the different one. I released a 74 times the different 7, the difference is a and a ground diter. The turning point was not the coup. It was the moment the constituent republics realized the central government could no longer compel obedience, because it could no longer pay the military to enforce unity. The mechanism revealed. 3 empires, 3 centuries, 3 different political systems, but the exact same 6-stage sequence. This is not coincidence. This is mathematics. A recurring pattern governed by principles that transcend culture, geography, and ideology. Ray Dalio, who analyzed every major debt crisis over the past 500 years, calls it the big debt cycle, a 75 to 100-year pattern that repeats with mechanical precision. The sequence is always the same. The only variables are the names and the timeline. Every dominant empire begins with a strategic advantage, a military technology, a geographic position, or an economic innovation that allows it to project power beyond its borders. Rome had the legions. Spain had naval supremacy. Britain had industrialization. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. The United States has 750 military bases in 80 countries. The trap is built into the advantage itself. Military dominance creates commitments. Those commitments require funding. And the cost of maintaining dominance grows faster than the economy that supports it. By the time Stage 1 is complete, the empire has locked itself into fixed obligations it cannot reduce without appearing weak. The military spending becomes structural, politically untouchable, economically unsustainable, and strategically irreversible. When military commitments exceed sustainable tax revenue, governments face a choice. Raise taxes, cut spending, or borrow. Raising taxes is politically toxic. Cutting military spending signals weakness, so they borrow. The borrowing begins gradually. bonds issued to finance wars or emergencies, deficit spending justified as temporary stimulus. But the debt never shrinks because the commitments never end. Instead, governments borrow to pay interest on previous borrowing, a practice known as rolling over the debt, where word author 1907, who described downhes and anausa, Ray Dalio identifies the critical threshold. When debt reaches 150% of GDP, the mathematics becomes irreversible. At that point, interest payments consume so much tax revenue that governments cannot fund normal operations without borrowing more. The debt becomes self-reinforcing, a compound interest trap with no exit except default or inflation. When a government cannot repay its debts in real value, it repays them in diluted currency. This is not theory. It is historical inevitability. As Ray Dalio states, when countries have big debt problems and the debt is denominated in their currency, they inevitably devalue the currency. In Rome, this meant reducing the silver content of coins from 90% to less than 5% over 70 years. In Weimar Germany, it meant printing money until prices doubled every 3.7 days and the mark became worthless. In modern economies, it means quantitative easing central banks, creating currency to purchase government bonds, expanding the money supply without expanding productivity. The mechanism is always identical. Increase the supply of currency faster than the supply of goods and services. The mathematical result is always the same: inflation. Inflation is not a side effect. It is the policy. It allows governments to repay debt in currency worth less than when borrowed. A government that owes $1 trillion and then inflates the currency by 50% has effectively cut its debt burden in half, not through repayment, but through devaluation. But this creates a secondary crisis. Citizens who hold the currency lose purchasing power. Savers are punished. Fixed-income retirees discover their pensions by half as much as planned. Workers demand higher wages, which drives prices higher, which requires more money printing, which accelerates inflation, creating the spiral that destroyed Rome, Spain, Weimar, Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. When currency becomes unreliable, long-distance trade collapses. Why would a manufacturer in Germany accept payment in devalued currency from Britain? Why would a factory in China continue producing goods for dollars if those dollars might be worth 30% less next year? Trade contracts require currency stability. Without it, international commerce reverts to barter or simply stops. Domestically, productive industries are replaced by speculation. When saving currency loses value, citizens invest in real estate, stocks, or commodities, not because these are productive, but because they are inflation hedges. Capital flows away from building factories and toward buying existing assets, inflating bubbles that will eventually burst. Specialized skills disappear. Roman craftsmen who made sophisticated glass or metalwork died without passing their knowledge to the next generation because no one could afford to pay apprentices in worthless currency. British industrial expertise migrated to America after 1945 because American dollars held value. Soviet engineers in the 1,980 seconds worked in factories with 1,950 seconds equipment because the system had no mechanism to reward innovation. It is with 3 eyes. The result is deindustrialization, the hollowing out of the economic base that created the empire's wealth in the first place. This is the stage where the population realizes the system is broken, not because economists explain it, because they experience it in daily life. Prices rising faster than wages, pensions inadequate, savings worthless, promises broken. Ray Dalio describes this as the moment interclass tensions come to a head. The wealth gap, always present, becomes unbearable when combined with currency debasement. The wealthy can protect themselves with hard assets and foreign accounts. The middle and working classes cannot. Their savings evaporate. Their labor buys less. And they watch elites prosper while their own security collapses. Political polarization accelerates. Populist movements arise on both left and right, united only in their rejection of the existing order. Trust in institutions, government, media, central banks disintegrates. The social contract dissolves. Citizens stop believing the system works for them and start viewing it as a mechanism of extraction. This is not a political problem. It is the mathematical consequence of currency debasement combined with wealth concentration. No empire has ever reversed the sequence once it reaches stage 5. The mathematics are locked in. The social fractures are irreparable. The only question is, what form the reset takes. Sometimes it is collapse, the Soviet Union dissolving in 900 days. Sometimes it is restructuring, Rome under Diocletian, creating an entirely new system. Sometimes it is liquidation, Britain decolonizing and defaulting on sterling balances. Sometimes it is war. Governments externalize internal tensions through conflict. But it is always a reset. The old system ends, a new one begins. And the currency, the political structure, or the territorial boundaries, are fundamentally reorganized. The sequence has never changed. The only variable is time. The modern parallel, USA 2026. Let us now apply the six-stage pattern to the United States in January 2026, not as speculation, as pattern recognition. A checklist. Stage 1. Military overextension. Completed. The United States maintains 750 military installations in approximately 80 countries. This is not defense, this is empire. No other nation in human history has projected military power across 6 continents simultaneously while maintaining the logistical infrastructure to deploy force anywhere on Earth within 48 hours. The annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion more than the next 10 countries combined. But the true cost is hidden in adjacent budgets: Veterans Affairs, Department of Energy, nuclear weapons, Homeland Security, intelligence agencies, and interest on debt incurred from previous wars. The actual national security expenditure approaches $1.3 trillion annually. These are not discretionary commitments. They are structural obligations built into alliance systems, treaty guarantees, and forward-deployed forces that cannot be withdrawn without signaling American retreat. The United States crossed the overextension threshold decades ago. Stage 1 is complete. Stage 2, debt accumulation, completed. On the 15th of November 2024, the United States national debt officially crossed $36 trillion. By January 2026, projections indicate it has reached approximately $37 trillion and is accelerating. The debt increases by roughly $1 trillion every 90 days, $333 billion per month, $11 billion per day, $7.6 million every minute. The current debt to GDP ratio stands at 122%. For historical context, Britain's empire collapsed when its ratio hit 249% in 1945. But the velocity matters as much as the absolute number. The United States added $2 trillion in debt in 2024 alone. At current trajectory, the debt will exceed 150% of GDP Ray Dalio's identified point of no return by 2030. More critical than the total debt is the cost of servicing it. Annual interest payments now exceed $1 trillion per year. This is more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any discretionary spending category. And it is compounding. By mid-2026, interest payments are projected to reach $2 billion per day. The United States government is now borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing, the definition of a debt trap. Stage 2 is complete. Stage 3, currency debasement, completed. Between 2008 and 2022, the Federal Reserve engaged in 3 rounds of quantitative easing, expanding the money supply by approximately $5 trillion. This is currency creation, printing money to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, injecting liquidity into the financial system without corresponding increases in productive output. The Consumer Price Index shows the mathematical result. Inflation reached 7% in 2021, 8% in 2022, and remained elevated at 4 to 5% through 2023 before moderating. The cumulative effect. The dollar has lost approximately 30% of its purchasing power since 2000 and 20% since 2020 alone. Thanks for watching. And I was another word of a zitter. But official inflation metrics understate the actual debasement experienced by citizens. Housing costs, healthcare, and education, the 3 largest household expenditures, have increased faster than headline CPI. A house that cost $200,000 in 2000 now costs $400,000, $500,000 in most metropolitan areas. College tuition has tripled. Healthcare premiums have doubled. Meanwhile, the dollar's reserve currency status is eroding. In 2000, the dollar comprised 71% of global central bank reserves. By 2024, that figure had declined to approximately 58%. BRICS nations are conducting bilateral trade in local currencies, bypassing dollar settlement. The de-dollarization is not dramatic, but it is measurable and accelerating. The United States is debasing its currency through monetary expansion, the exact mechanism that preceded collapse in Rome, Spain, and Britain. Stage 3 is complete. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, in progress. In 1979, manufacturing employed 5 million Americans. By 2023, that number had fallen to approximately 12.9 million, despite a population increase of 100 million people. The United States now produces fewer physical goods relative to GDP than at any point since industrialization. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility. Semiconductor shortages halted automobile production. Pharmaceutical supply chains collapsed. PPE shortages forced hospitals to reuse masks. The The most advanced economy in human history discovered it could not manufacture basic medical supplies domestically because production had been offshored to China and Southeast Asia. This is not just about jobs, it is about capability. The United States has lost the institutional knowledge required for advanced manufacturing at scale. The engineers who designed factories retired. The technicians who operated complex machinery were not replaced. The supply chains that connected raw materials to finished products were dissolved in pursuit of quarterly profit optimization. Meanwhile, capital flows into speculation rather than production. Real estate investment, stock buybacks, cryptocurrency trading, and private equity, all activities that reallocate existing wealth without creating new productive capacity. When saving currency loses value to inflation, citizens invest in assets that appreciate nominally, even if they produce nothing. Thank you. Resuited, and a nowhere down, the hollowing out is underway. Stage 4 is in progress. Stage 5. Social fracture, current location. This is where the United States stands in January 2026. Political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War. Trust in government institutions is at historic lows. Media fragmentation has created parallel information ecosystems where citizens cannot agree on basic facts. The 2024 presidential election demonstrated the depth of the divide, not just disagreement over policy, but fundamental disputes about legitimacy, process, and reality itself. The wealth gap is approaching Gilded Age extremes. The top 1% of Americans now control approximately 32% of national wealth, while the bottom 50% control less than 2%. This disparity is amplified by inflation. When housing costs rise 8% annually, but wages rise 3%, the gap between asset owners and wage earners widens mathematically. The wealthy benefit from asset appreciation. The working class experiences currency debasement. The population is beginning to realize that the system is structurally rigged not through conspiracy, but through monetary policy that rewards those who own assets while punishing those who rely on wages. Student debt cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, but corporate debt is refinanced. Bank failures trigger bailouts, but homeowner foreclosures do not. Quantitative easing inflates stock prices while eroding purchasing power. This is Ray Dalio's Stage 5. The interclass tensions come to a head. Not because people are irrational, but because they correctly perceive that the mechanisms of wealth accumulation favor those who already have wealth. The United States is at Stage 5. The mathematics are locked in. The social fractures are widening. Stage 6. The reset. Next. In 2,000 years of recorded history, no empire has ever stopped the sequence once Stage 5 begins. The only question is what form the reset takes. Digital currency to enable central bank control of monetary policy. Debt jubilee to wipe unsustainable obligations. Hyperinflation to liquidate debt through currency destruction. Geopolitical conflict to externalize internal tensions. Or systemic collapse followed by restructuring the Diocletian solution. The timeline is uncertain. The sequence is not. The prediction and conclusion. The pattern has repeated 5 times in recorded history. Rome, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, and now the United States. Each time, the sequence was identical. Each time, observers believed their empire was different, too advanced, too powerful, too sophisticated to follow the pattern. Each time, they were wrong. The mathematics do not negotiate. The sequence does not pause. And history has shown that once Stage 5 begins, Stage 6 is inevitable. He was now as to or 7, previous today, or 2000 place. But I was one of the presses, one of the constated one of the coupling this place. There are 3 scenarios for the reset. Scenario 1. The managed collapse. Central banks implement central bank digital currencies, allowing direct control over monetary policy at the individual transaction level. This enables precise inflation targeting, negative interest rates, and programmable money that expires if not spent. Simultaneously, governments negotiate debt restructuring, a modern version of Britain's 1,947 default, where creditors accept partial payment rather than total loss. This is the soft landing scenario, painful but survivable. Currency resets, savings are partially confiscated through inflation or direct haircuts, but the system remains functional. Timeline, 2027 to 2030. Scenario 2, the financial crisis. Debt servicing costs exceed 50% of tax revenue by 2028. The Federal Reserve responds with unlimited quantitative easing, triggering a loss of confidence in dollar stability. Foreign holders dump treasury bonds. The dollar loses reserve currency status. Inflation accelerates into hyperinflation, similar to Weimar Germany in 1923 or Zimbabwe in 2008. This is the chaotic scenario. Savings evaporate, supply chains collapse, social order fractures, the government loses legitimacy. Eventually, A new currency emerges, likely backed by commodities or a basket of assets, but only after years of economic devastation. Timeline: 2029 to 2035. Scenario 3. The geopolitical reset. Unable to manage internal contradictions, the United States externalizes tensions through conflict with China, Iran, or Russia. War provides political justification for emergency economic measures: capital controls, rationing, debt suspension, and currency freezing. The conflict restructures global trade, ends dollar hegemony, and creates regional currency blocks. This is the historical precedent. Britain entered 2 world wars that bankrupted the empire but restructured the global order. Rome's crisis of the 3rd century included constant warfare. War is how empires traditionally reset when internal reform is politically impossible. Timeline: 2026 to 2032. You cannot stop the sequence, but you can prepare for it. Preserve purchasing power. Convert depreciating currency into hard assets: gold, silver, productive land, essential commodities. These maintain value through currency transitions. History shows that those who held real assets during Rome's collapse, Britain's decolonization, and the Soviet dissolution preserved wealth across the reset. Develop real skills. Learn productive capabilities that generate value regardless of monetary system. Agriculture, construction, medical skills, engineering. When currency fails, those who can produce essential goods or services remain economically viable. Build local networks. The collapse of Rome destroyed long-distance trade, but communities with local production survived. The Soviet collapse was survived by those with strong family and neighborhood connections. Social capital becomes economic capital during systemic transitions. Understand the pattern. Knowledge is preparation. Those who recognize the sequence in real time can act while others remain in denial. The Romans who buried silver, hoards in 260 CE, preserved wealth. The British who moved capital to America before 1947 avoided devaluation. The Soviets who positioned themselves for independence before 1991 prospered afterward. Empires do not end with explosions, they end with exhaustion. A slow grinding down of capacity, legitimacy, and social cohesion that feels manageable year by year until suddenly it is not. The real danger is not dramatic collapse. It is the gradual normalization of decline. Accepting that infrastructure crumbles, that promises are broken, that savings erode, that opportunities narrow, that the future will be worse than the past. By the time the population realizes the system has fundamentally changed, the reset is already complete. Rome did not fall in a day. It declined over 2 centuries. But the crisis of the 3rd century, stage 6, happened in 50 years once the sequence reached stage 5. Britain maintained appearances for years after 1945, but the empire was gone by 1954. The Soviet Union seemed permanent in 1989. It ceased to exist in 1991. The sequence never changed. The timing varies, but the outcome is mathematical. In January 2026, the United States stands at stage 5. The national debt exceeds $37 trillion and grows by $2 billion per day. Interest payments consume over $1 trillion annually. The currency has lost 30% of its value since 2000. Manufacturing capacity has hollowed out. Political polarization is at civil war levels. Trust in institutions is collapsing. The pattern is clear. The mathematics are locked in, and history has shown that no empire, no matter how powerful, has ever escaped the sequence once stage 5 begins. The sequence has never changed. The only variable is time.